Today on this Mastering Warhammer 40K series, we are going to be talking about bubbles, more specifically, threat bubbles. All right. So if you're somebody that is just a beginner, maybe just starting Warhammer 40K 10th edition, or you've been playing at it for a while and you're just looking to improve your game a little bit, you're going to want to stick around because I'm going to be dropping some knowledge today about some threat bubbles. So let's get into it. Now, things we're going to be talking about over the course of this video is what do I mean by threat bubbles? How does it affect our deployment? How does it affect our shooting units? And how does it affect our melee units? These are very, very important things to think about, especially for those important units like your Angron, your Silent King, Vorpek Lord, stuff like that. But you try to use, wanted to put Angron up as like an example from like other armies, but my hope for you today is even though if you don't play Necrons, you're still going to get value out of it no matter what army you play, because these are just going to be general concepts that you can apply into your next game this weekend, hopefully, or with a friend coming up soon. So let's start at the top. And what do we mean when we're talking about threat bubbles? Like, what is a threat bubble? Okay, so simple terms, everybody knows World Eaters, everybody knows Angron or Angry Ron. Okay, so we got Angry Ron right here. He is on the battlefield. Boom. All right. Behind the deployment zone. Good to go. All right. Now, when we're talking about threat bubbles, what do we mean by that? We are essentially talking about how much of the board can this unit cover as far as like a threat range. And as you can see, Angron's threat bubble is like massive because he flies. You can give him advance and charge. You can give him +2 move, and he's already moving 14 inches. So, I mean, he can literally get anywhere that he wants. I mean, he can literally, move, up here, advance and charge some over here, or he could go here, advance and charge. I mean, he can literally just get anywhere he wants. So his threat bubble is crazy big. Okay. Now, let's talk about something a little bit more simple. So let's say we don't have Angron, and let's just say we just have like a unit of Scorpex. This could be like, I don't know. I mean, this could be like some Bullgrin or something, right? You're like a melee unit. So their threat bubble is going to be a little bit smaller because maybe they don't have access to advance and charge. They don't have like a super fast movement, or they don't have fly, where, these Scorpec destroyers, maybe their threat range is something like this. Okay. Because essentially they can move 8, right, and then they can charge. Okay, so it's still decent, which makes them a really good unit, but it's not something like Angron, and that's where beginner players don't necessarily realize up front and how these units are costed the way that they are and their value, especially when it comes to movement. And if you're talking about like an Angron type unit, for example, because they can threaten just so much of the board right out of the gate that you have to account for. So that's what we mean when we're talking about threat bubbles. And every unit in the game has a different range because they have access to different abilities. It could be charge, it could be movement, they could have a react movement, all these sorts of things that add a lot of variety and replayability to the game, to different threat ranges. Now, how does this affect deployment? All right, so let's take Angron, for example. And again, we're talking like very simple terms here. I don't want to go like, we're going to go granular on this topic, but, I also don't want it to be like super complex and confusing. Okay, so in simple terms, like with Angron, so a lot of people starting out, they might want to stage him like behind a wall here or behind a footprint here because he can't stage like behind a wall because you could probably see him. Or you might swing them over here. Now, a couple things you have to think about. Again, it does depend on your game plan. There are a lot of variables here, but this is just thinking from like a macro perspective or a bird's eye view where a beginner player may not necessarily think about, but a lot of times the best option is to put Angron in the center somewhere because it gives you the flexibility to cover this much of the board, because his threat range is so massive, right? So by putting him in the center, it gives you the ultimate flexibility in terms of wherever you need him to go, depending on, especially if your opponent goes first, you can put him there. Versus if you put him over here, right, the threat bubble changes. And now all of a sudden it looks like something like this, where he's only covering this section of the board. And so if your opponent swings hard over here, you really need that resource over there, that damage to interact with. Now you can't do that because of where he is and kind of. And then again, same thing up here, right? So I won't do the threat bubble, but if you put him up here, he's only this objective. And okay, so things to think about as far as for deployment. Now, again, this is also for, let's take a classic shooting unit. Okay, so let's take like a Hexmark Destroyer. All right, so for him, or with shooting units in general, is you also have to think about like how you want to utilize this deployment when using these guys. So for him, let's say same thing. We deploy him in the center because we have the intent. Again, he's not a melee unit, but he's a shooting unit. But we want to make sure that he can move out here and he still has enough range to cover 18 inches on this center objective right here. Okay. So when we're talking about shooting units, we're also talking about their threat range in terms of shooting and not in melee. So things to consider there when we're talking about threat bubbles, where, he has a range, essentially with his medics when he moves of something like this. And the same thing applies when you're talking about deployment, where it gives you the ultimate flexibility. If you really need this piece to cover this area over here or this area over here, it gives you that flexibility. Again, that's just matchup and who. Okay. Let's take another piece, for example, right? How it affects deployment. Silent King is a very good example. Okay. So the big thing with the Silent King, or like if you're talking about like an indirect platform, his range is only 24 inches. So it's not 48. So it's a decent mid-range gun, but he's not going to be covering the whole board. And because of that, you have to account for it. So again, deployment really matters when you're talking about the Silent King. Again, this will vary up depending on the matchup and what you need him to do. But you got to remember that, if you deploy him over here, he's really only going to be able to interact with this objective and this objective with his indirect. Versus if you deploy him in the center, it gives you more flexibility where he could swing over here, interact with here. He could swing over here, interact with here. And the same thing with his indirect is it's going to cover all of these objectives. Okay. So things to consider there. And same thing as far as I'll get into that because that's going to be in the next section here. So just around the Silent King here, and then let's go into, again, how do we maximize this for our shooting units? So again, going back to, like, let's say a Illuminar Xeris. All right, so he has Lone Up. He's not like a crazy shooting platform. He's only got 3 shots at 933, but just a generality here as a shooting platform. Again, what are we thinking about? So we have to take his movement into account. So if I place him here, right, now all of a sudden, if we look at his threat range where he moves, let's say he only moves 8, but he's not able to move far enough over to clear this line over here. Okay. So what ends up happening is he's just short and you can't interact with this objective, but he can move over here. My voice cracks and cover this line over here. Okay. So again, on deployment, it's super big. A lot of times these shooting units, you want to deploy them in the center of a footprint rather than on one side or the other, because what ends up happening is it gives you the flexibility where, okay, now I can move Xeris over here. He can swing down this firing lane because of his threat bubble, and he can swing over here, fire down this firing lane. Okay. Let's take Silent King. He's probably a much better example because he's got all sorts of shots, right? So we have like the 2 Minears, we have the indirect, and we have the staff, right? The same type of idea. He only moves 8 inches. He's not slow, but he's not really fast either. And same type of problem, right? So if I have him all the way over here, a lot of times he can't move all the way over here and get this angle, right? He can you're only limiting him just to move over here and shoot down this. Same thing applies if you go the other way, right? So if I put him here, just like with the Luminar Xeris, right? Now you give him the flexibility to move here, cover this, move here, cover this. All right. So kind of similar to our firing lane video last week, and how these interact is you're thinking about, okay, the flexibility, a threat bubble of to move in both directions. Okay. So by moving this unit, you're changing, right, where essentially you can interact with that footprint. So again, if I move him down here, right? So if I move him here, he probably doesn't have enough movement to cover over here, and then vice versa. So a lot of times with your shooting units, to give you the maximum flexibility because you don't know where your opponent's going to go, a good rule of thumb is usually wanting to center them on the objective or behind a footprint, and obviously behind LOS if you can. That's always priority number one, out of LOS. And the second thing is if you can center it, it gives you flexibility to swing to either side. All right. Now, again, let's talk about melee units. All right, so let's go back to let's just use like Scorpex, for example. We have our Scorpec Lord. He's staged up behind the wall, and same type of idea. Okay, so here, stage up behind the wall, he can reliably kind of cover this area of the field, turn one. Okay, and these are big examples because just by shifting him back here, right? Let's say even on my deployment, right? I shift him back here. This is a melee unit. Completely changes what his threat range is, because now if he moves 8, now all of a sudden if he wants to interact with a unit that's on an objective, he might need like a 9 or a 10-inch charge, versus by deploying him here, he's going to need like a 5 or a 6 because I staged him farther up going first, right? So bear that in mind as well. So if he's back here, you know, your threat bubble now reliably is looking something like this, okay? And same type of idea with melee units is, you know, thinking about where you really want these units to interact, okay? And a lot of times, you know, when you're staging up units, you want to play them depending on the board state to give you flexibility to threaten either these objectives or these objectives, okay, with your threat bubble. So if I move, like, if I move him up here, now all that does is just it lets me interact with this objective. Really awesome, you know, cool. But just by this simple play with this melee unit, taking him from here to over here, now all of a sudden you've completely changed the board state of what he can do, and now all of a sudden he can threaten both of these, and you're getting double the value for that unit. Just those little things with melee units are huge when we're talking about threat bubbles. Let's switch this back here, and let's talk about Engron. So going back to melee units, so going back to our example, we deploy him on the line. And the reason why we're maximizing the efficiency for this melee unit is because now he's essentially covering this whole board, right? Versus if we put him in a corner here, vice versa. So, and then same thing where we want to stage, right? So when we're thinking about staging, you know, we obviously couldn't stage him really right here because there's potentially shooting lanes. So when we're thinking about staging, a lot of times the next safest spot, it could potentially be here depending on the board state, but a lot of times the natural progression is he could go right here. Again, we want him to fly here, probably not far over here, because again, it limits where his threat range could be. In this far corner, maybe his threat range is only about, you know, that now, versus if he was here on an advance in charge, he's still covered behind the wall, but now he's like really covering all these objectives just by that simple placement. So in your next game, I highly encourage you to think about this with your units and just think about their threat ranges, whether it's melee or in shooting, and how you're deploying those units to make sure you maximize their efficiency. It's a very important technique to get down. You're not going to get it right on the first try. It takes practice, so don't worry about that. But again, what do we mean when we say by threat bubbles? How does it affect deployment? And the biggest thing is you want to deploy, a lot of times, your shooting units behind LOS or behind footprints, so you're out of LOS, and making sure that they can swing to either side of the footprint to get their firing lanes. And make sure you're maximizing the shooting units, and then maximizing the units as well. So again, hope you found this video helpful. If you stuck around this long, I appreciate you watching. I'm going to link 2 videos up top. We will catch you in the